welcome to Personal Finance. I'm Gugulethu Cele. Now today we come to you from the heartbeat of one of the Southern Hemisphere's most populous townships, Soweto, where the South African Savings Institute has launched its annual conference, and we're here at Maponya Mall where a variety of topics have actually been attended to, such as the sandwich generation together with BlackTax. Now that might not be a concept that you're familiar with, but to explain this and many other avenues for us this evening, I'm joined by Ayabonga Cawe, who is an expert, or rather, let's not call him an expert, BlackTax expert. We might get into trouble for that. He's an economist and also representing Rethink Africa. Ayabonga, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's talk about this theme called BlackTax. It's something that not many people are familiar with. What does it entail and what is it?
So I mean, I guess there's the global definition, which a lot of people have used in America, which is referring collectively to all of the hurdles that black people face in achieving their financial independence. I think, especially among black youth in South Africa now, it's taken a different kind of tone or a different kind of messaging. And what we're calling it now is hashtag BlackTax. Now, hashtag BlackTax covers sort of the disparities in the ownership of assets or in the assets that people inherit between young professionals who are black and young professionals who are white. It also speaks to some of the challenges around conspicuous consumption and status signaling that we largely see in our black communities relative to sort of more established wealth in the white community. And in addition to that, I think it speaks to some of the spatial and physical and sort of socio-economic and socio-cultural hurdles that people face in achieving financial independence. One of the examples, for instance, that I used in our discussion today was the situation of interns that are working in the public service and how earning, say, between 3,500 Rand and 5,000 Rand a month when you live furthest from the place of employment has implications. So you end up spending more of your money on transport, but also in terms of your responsibilities at home, they don't fit the traditional sort of nuclear sphere of responsibility. And I think the responsibility and expectation in our own communities tends to be non-nuclear and tends to be way more extensive than those of our white counterparts. So I think when we say it's BlackTax, I think it does also take on a racial nature. And I think we need to outline that, right? Because if you think about a lot of the people who have a challenge around savings and also a challenge around indebtedness, you know, it's overwhelmingly people that come from the black community, and I think that's where the term hashtag BlackTax comes from.
And it is something that's so relevant because obviously, as you allude to, it's the challenges that a lot of young entrepreneurs and black people actually face. But within the organization that you represent, it seems as though you are working to find workable solutions that can be implemented, not only in South Africa, but maybe across the borders as well. What do they entail?
Look, I think so. So our organization is a policy research and policy advocacy organization. So a great deal of our work is actually looking at the evidence of what approaches have worked elsewhere. And I think there are a lot of transitions that are happening in the financial services space that also need to impact on the savings cultures in our countries. So one of the things that is happening now is that you're having a confluence between telecoms players and also retail players that are banking the unbanked. So there's a shift away from traditional branch banking where you go into a financial institution, you sit down, you wait in a queue and you get served, to actually having a lot more of food retailers and a lot of telecoms providers actually providing banking and financial services to those who didn't have bank accounts before. And I think for us as an organization, that is a key advocacy opportunity because it says to us, how do we begin to use those innovations in the space to really begin to push the envelope in terms of how we save, but also to leverage the communal culture that it has existed since time immemorial, especially in black communities around stokvels, to actually link those two developments. So one of the things, for instance, that we're saying is, how do we begin to create a relationship between your retail players and your telecoms and stokvel as a body? Particularly the retail players, because you know, a lot of our mothers who are part of stokvels or imibuto, you save up for the entire year, and then towards the end of the year, you use that to buy groceries or to have a huge stokvel party where you're buying from the retailers. And I think there's a case to be made about creating some kind of formal relationship between the retailers themselves and the organized bodies of stokvels.
I'm happy you mentioned that, but the key question obviously is, what is the feedback like, especially with regard to that engagement? Because sometimes there's a perception that these institutions often view each other as competition, trying to attract the stokvel market.
So I mean, we haven't had an opportunity to formally engage organizations like NASASA and organizations in the retail space. But I think if I can speak about some of the feedback to the concept of BlackTax, I think you've had a pushback from a wide range of people across all generational spans. Because there's a sense that, this isn't a tax in the sense that it's an obligatory thing that you don't want to pay. It's something that you want to pay, but also from a cultural perspective, Sinobuntu, we want to pay these things. And I think that doesn't take away from the consumption, investment, and savings implications of having non-nuclear spheres of responsibility, but also having some of the pressures that come from status signaling and also the catch-up that is associated with historic asset deficits in the black community.
Coming back from your background where you are an economist, does it all go back down to maybe regulation and policies that we have in place where there's some kind of government support, or as you mentioned, other financial institutions who are able to alleviate the issues regarding the sandwich generation and black tax in particular?
So I was really interested in an input made by the Chief Director from the National Treasury today around some of the matching contributions and sort of using UIF funds and existing public development funds to really get to a workable model. And I think that's the kind of thinking that we need to get. I think in particular there needs to be a lot more conversation between the public sector and the private sector. And it shouldn't just end with sort of tax-free savings, but there needs to be a question around how do we innovate in the space to really link telco providers, traditional financial services providers, the regulators in the public service, but also the people that are crafting the policy at department level in the National Treasury to really get to workable solutions that from the onset really engage some of the challenges and the constraints and the difficulties faced by young black professionals through BlackTax, but also some of our parents as young black professionals through their challenges as part of the sandwich generation. I also want to add though that, as one of the panelists mentioned today, that there's a difference in terms of the extent of the sandwich generation phenomenon across income profiles. And I think if we really look at the income distribution in South Africa, which is probably one of the most unequal societies in the world, then we also understand that the sandwich generation phenomena takes on a racialized character as well. And there's a need to really explore how we begin to deal with that issue in a country which is faced with a large wage inequality gap, but also asset inequality as well, all of which have an intergenerational character.
Education was also something that came up during the Q&A session on the panel. What are your views on that? Because it almost seems as though you need to capture all the various age groups to really drive the message home.
Look, I think for me it's two things. And I laud the great work that an institution like the South African Savings Institute is undertaking from an advocacy perspective. And I think, I made an example of the advocacy work that has been done in South Africa around HIV and AIDS and what lessons we can learn from that to really mainstream the idea of having a savings culture, something that's mutually beneficial for all of us. So I think there's that part, which is how do you use multiple media platforms, TV, radio, social media increasingly, to really mainstream that idea. But in addition to that, I think we need to get to the primary and secondary levels of education and really look to use the existing space in our life orientation programs to really steer that towards sort of developing the financial literacy and entrepreneurial skills that young people need. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that a lot of the LO component isn't really responsive to the challenges that a lot of young people face when they leave school or where they go into training or higher education and then transition towards employment. So there's a need at that early age, just like we had healthcare education before and Bible education before that, to really mainstream in the curricula financial literacy, entrepreneurial training, and those kind of things. And I think there's a discussion or conversation to be had with the Department of Basic Education around how we achieve that.
But also, it also starts with individuals like you and I and the people who are watching the show, because clearly there also needs to be a mindset change there. And you alluded to conspicuous consumption, the challenges that they face, and obviously with BlackTax also being at the helm of that. How do we change that mindset for Gugu and Ayabonga who are watching at home this evening?
I think education is one component of it, but also I think there's an issue of groupthink as well. You may find yourself in a stokvel with people who are around our age, but still find that there's status signaling even within the group. There's levels, as we say, even within the group, and I think those are the challenges that we need to begin. And we need to have very frank discussions about our financial health. Just like we have frank discussions about your physical health or your mental health or your spiritual health, we need to actually sit down and have these frank discussions around how we begin to create forms of solidarity that really build wealth in our own communities. So I was saying earlier on today that there's an entire culture of stokvels. However, those stokvels are largely driven towards consumption and to disbursement of funds in the group. And I think there's a need for us to really localize sort of the pooling of those funds, but also localize the investment of those funds. How beautiful would it be, for instance, if you had all of the Stokvels and Pimville coming together and then using a portion of the funds that they have to really build socially beneficial infrastructure in their communities, libraries, clinics, childcare homes, and a range of other things that respond to the challenges that the community at a local level has. And there's a role to play in that space, as I said, for the private sector, but there's also a role to play for the public sector. And I think the public sector can play a coordinating role in that space and really lead and drive that process.
Ayabonga, thank you so much for your time today. We certainly look forward to catching up with you on the progress that your organization makes. Thank you so much for your time today. As mentioned, we certainly look forward to getting a follow-up as to the progress that Rethink Africa does make when it comes to #BlackTax and driving savings in South Africa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Well, that was Ayabonga Cawe, who is representing Rethink Africa and is also an economist. Do be sure to get in touch with us via our social media platforms. You can get in touch using the #Finance410 or our account name at CNBC Africa, or even myself at Gugulethu on Twitter. Until next time, do join us again where we talk more on personal finance.